You know, Wales is full of so many special places, and this is one I never tire of visiting. Tenby and Sir Benfro, or if you prefer, Tenby in Little England beyond Wales. But I think we lose so much in the rather prosaic English translations of Welsh place names. So, Tenby. It is indeed the small fort of the fish, but there's so much more about the history of this place. It doesn't matter what time of year, I always enjoy my visits here. In high summer, the town buzzes with life, and on fine days, the glorious beach is absolutely chock-a-block. But in the winter time, and here in the autumn, it takes on a different character and becomes once again the domain of the locals. One of my small pleasures is to wander the narrow streets and lanes, seeking out those glimpses of the sea or the harbour. And those vistas and visions appear sometimes unexpectedly, but oh, always so most welcome. And of course it's the sea that has and still does play such an important role in the history of Tenby. But one of the key elements, of course, was this utterly delightful little harbour. And it's a bit of a steep climb up from the harbour, but nevertheless, this pathway leads us to a very important outcrop of rock that dominates both the harbour and the surrounding countryside. And this is the actual strategic location of the Tenby, the small fort, which was mentioned in the laws of Hywel Dda in the 9th century. But of course, like so many of our indigenous Welsh castles, it was taken over by the Anglo-Norman invaders, and they were active in the area here from 1093 onwards. Those invaders didn't have an easy time of it though, because this castle was attacked on a number of occasions. In 1187, the town was actually burned. It was because of the constant attacks that the castle was refortified and the town walls were built in 1245. They were actually rebuilt in 1457. And once you've made the effort of climbing up to take a look at the castle, you must come and visit this place, this wonderful museum. I know it's closed now because of COVID, but when it reopens again, it's the best place to find out a little more about Tenby's history. And indeed, this is a piece of history in its own right, because it was, I think it is, one of the oldest, if not the oldest museum in Wales. It was opened in 1878. Tenby saw a little bit of action during the Civil War, and that was followed very quickly in the 1650s by a very virulent plague. About half the population died or left the town, and even by the 18th century, it was still in a pretty sorry state. John Wesley described it as 2/3 of the town is in ruins or has entirely vanished. Pigs roam among the abandoned houses, and Tenby presents a dismal spectacle. Thankfully, this house has survived. It's the 15th century Tudor merchant's house, which is now in the care of the National Trust. We don't know much about that particular merchant, but he must have been fairly wealthy to have built a house of this scale. It even had the most, well for then anyway, modern conveniences. A latrine tower that served all 3 floors and discharged into a cesspit at its base. But there was a downside. The cesspit was very small and therefore had limited capacity, and located right next to the main cooking hearth. It doesn't take much imagination to think about the aroma of cooking being enhanced by other smells, let alone the delights of carrying and emptying buckets, as an archaeologist described it, of human organic material through the house. One of my most prized possessions is a book called The Etchings of Tenby by this chap, Charles Norris, who was an artist who produced the most delightful and informative views of the town, coupled with some really impressive descriptions. But Tenby's resurgence and establishment as a major holiday resort was due mainly to the efforts of one man, Sir William Paxton. Now here was someone to really get things going. In addition to being very wealthy, at one time he was the master of the Bengal Mint, he also had vision and drive. He embarked on a program of house repair and new building, and, so importantly, the provision of fresh water into the town. Under his patronage and influence, he really established Tenby as a most important tourist destination. In the early 19th century, it was the place to visit. Saltwater bathing was all the rage, and Paxton instigated the building of a new bathhouse on the site of an earlier one. And he engaged Samuel Cockerell Pepys, the architect. And yes, indeed, that architect was a distant relation of the famous diarist. The Greek inscription by Euripides translates as, "All man's pollution does the sea cleanse." Well, that may well have been true in 1810, 1811, when this building was constructed. I'm not sure it holds true today with the amount of plastic that we have floating around in our oceans. Evidently the baths are open at all hours. You could have a warm saltwater bath for 2 and 6pence. You could have a hot shower for 1 and 6pence, or it cost you 9pence if you just wanted to swim. Well, given those prices, perhaps it's understandable why the locals just stripped off and went to swim in the sea. But a visitor to the town noted his pleasure, and this is what he quoted. He said, his pleasure in coming across female peasantry enjoying without disguise the delicious coolness and delight of bathing in the open sea. Perhaps it was a little bit of early 19th century voyeurism. A great feature were the bathing machines, when people other than the common peasantry could take to the water, as it were, undercover. Another lovely quote: "There were rules to be obeyed, and these included," and here's the quote, "no machine occupied by a gentleman shall be taken into the water at a less distance than 60 yards from another occupied by a lady, and of course vice versa." What a bunch of spoilsports they were, because the men were also exhorted to wear long drawers. Well, here in St. Mary's Church is this really delightful memorial to Peggy Davis, who was a bathing woman who worked for 42 years in the town and died at the grand old age of 82 years while she was still at work. This church is again one of my favourites. There's been a church on this site since the 13th century, or perhaps even earlier, although the present buildings date from the 15th century and later. It's thought that Giraldus Cambrensis, Gerald of Wales, was the first rector here. This church is always so beautifully maintained, and it's so full of history. Besides the architecture, which is absolutely superb, you have these terrific memorials, these Elizabethan memorials, so rare and so precious. The memorials in this church are just magnificent. There's so many and so varied, but one of my favorites is to this gentleman, Robert Record. As we can see, in addition to being a physician, he was also an eminent mathematician. Born in Tenby in about 1510, and he invented the universally adopted equal sign. How important that's been. For a small town, Tenby has been the birthplace or has attracted a number of notable visitors. For instance, Charles Allen, a Victorian photographer who set up a studio here in the 1840s. And in his house was the place that Roald Dahl used to come and stay in the 1920s and 1930s for their Easter holidays. Well, you know, I couldn't really come to Tenby and not mention Augustus Johns, who was born here in 1878. And then later, along with his sister Gwen, they were both granted freedom of the town. So many of the artists and the writers were attracted to this town because of not only the town itself, which is absolutely superb and beautiful, but for the views from it, looking out across the prom here, over towards Caldy Island, of course, and St. Catherine's Island behind me, where we can see the remains of a 19th century military fort. You know, as well as the town being famous for photographers and artists, I was really delighted to see this plaque here to Alison Bielski, poet and writer. She lived here between 1967 and 1970. I met her on a number of occasions, and what an incredibly talented woman she was. She wrote the most incredible poems about Welsh folklore, and she also wrote poems which she called concrete poems. And it was lovely. She was experimenting by writing without using capitals and by cutting down on the amount of punctuation. A really talented woman. You know, walking around this town and looking at the blue plaques is like a who's who of the early 18th century. And so many people of great note visited this town, including Lord Nelson, who was accompanied by Lady Emma Hamilton, who in turn was accompanied by her husband, Sir William Hamilton. And there's a lovely quote, I think it was a newspaper report at the time, said about how Horatio Nelson and Lady Emma walked around the town arm in arm, and Sir William came behind, a few paces behind, head erect and unabashed. Well, given the number of well-known people and events, people either born in the town or things that happened in the town, obviously I can't name them all, and I'm sure I've missed some. But a couple that spring to mind, of course, was Henry Tudor, who escaped towards France when he was a teenager by going through a tunnel under a building which is now Boots in the main street. And of course, Tenby was the birthplace of the actor Kenneth Griffith. We've called this film Vistas and Visions, and I hope it sums up something about this town. In the physical sense, it's absolutely true, but also it's a tribute to the women and men who've seen and developed its potential. So, a visit to this historic and architectural delight always gives me great pleasure, and I think it's beautifully summed up by the town's motto, which is, where the sea washes away all the ills of men. So let's celebrate Dinbych y Pysgod, the jewel of the West.